Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Super, super excited for this one. We have with us Micah Zoltu, who is, I'll attempt to give him an intro. I first learned about him. You were kind of working on the original Augur project originally, and then I've seen you in the Tornado Cash space, and then you've sort of been super active on Twitter in some of the restaking, issuance curve, ossification talk just throughout the years, and it's really great. I don't know, did I miss things? What's I guess the main, if you have an intro that I can sort of do you justice?
I think that does me more justice than I deserve. I argue a lot on the internet. I have fairly contrarian views compared to most mainstream. Unlike many people in this space, I'm very philosophically oriented or ideologically oriented. This leads me to argue a lot of people on the internet, because a lot of people on the internet, I think, get focused on how do we make ETH get everybody rich, rather than how do we make Ethereum censorship resistant and serve the purpose that I believe it was designed to serve, which is to fight against global totalitarianism and things like that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we can get into the ETH stuff and rant a little bit later, and I think some of this is going to get into it. But like originally, part of the reason that I wanted to have you on is we had just had Edmund Edgar on when we had talked about kind of the history, a little bit of Augur, what were some of the issues, and which is really popular now with sort of restaking and even a lot of these bridge and subjectivity designs. And you had actually worked on Augur, and then you also have recently put out some fixes or ways that people could potentially help mitigate some of the problems that we had discussed in the video. So I wanted to have you on to kind of discuss that. Yeah, maybe we can just kind of jump in. So I guess your design, if you want to kind of walk me through it, we can
Sure.
We draw it out.
So I'd like to start by giving credit to Edmund. I actually did watch your interview with him, and I was surprised. He did Augur better justice than just about anyone. Like he didn't make any mistakes. He was honest about where its faults were. Most people misunderstand Augur because it's relatively complicated. He did an excellent job of describing it. So when you start out, so if you haven't watched the previous video, go watch the previous video, and that's a good description of Augur as it is today, Augur V3, and including all the downsides you mentioned. The biggest downside that's always worried me. So when we designed the system, we were very clear about what the assumptions were. The system will work if this is true, but we don't know if that's true, right? And so one of those assumptions, and the one that worries me the most that may not be true, is that Augur as a system knows about all the open interest in its oracle, right? So the oracle, when it makes a resolution, how much money is on the line based on whether that resolves correctly or incorrectly. And so this is kind of one of those things that is very easy to show that it could not be true. And so the example I like to use is you have two billionaires, and they just do a handshake bet. And in this handshake bet, they both agree that whatever Augur resolves as, that's how their bet will be resolved. And so they both bet $1 billion with each other, and they don't tell anybody else about it. So only these two people in the world even know this bet exists. And they're just watching the Augur market. And they for whatever reason, they trust each other to go by whatever Augur says, and both of them maybe even know that the game here is really who can manipulate the Augur outcome better. And so then they both now have $1 billion of incentive to go and make Augur resolve incorrectly. Meanwhile, Augur thinks, oh, here's a market, and there's $1 million on it, and so the system is designed to protect it against $1 million of interest, under the assumption that if there's more than $1 million, someone might be able to profit off of making Augur lie. But Augur thinks, oh, there's only $1 million here. I can defend against $1 million in bets. In reality, though, there's over $1 billion in open interest, and so Augur cannot actually defend against that. And so someone can make a profit by causing Augur to lie in that situation. So we call that parasitic open interest. And again, Edmund did a reasonably good job of describing it, I think. And there's really no way to do this other than just kind of telling people about it and saying, please don't do this for two reasons. One, your bet will not be secure. And two, you're also making the whole system not secure for everybody else. And so it's kind of just we hope that no one goes and breaks the system, but we can't guarantee it. Again, these two billionaires, maybe the game is to see who can manipulate Augur more efficiently. Like that's the game to them. And so for them, trying to convince them that, oh, your bet's not going to resolve correctly. We can't guarantee that. They don't care. Like the game is to make it not resolve correctly. And so this has always worried me. And switching gears a little bit before we go into the theoretical solution, there's another type of system which is much closer to reality.eth, where I call it the colored coin system, and I think someone coined that term before me a long time ago. And basically, you just have a system that never actually resolves. All it does is says there's a true universe and a false universe, and anyone who creates markets in the future can create them on either the true or the false universe. But the system never actually says which one's true. It's just we assume that more markets will be created on the true universe, not the false universe. And so over time, the hypothesis is that people who own these false coins would not be able to sell them to anybody because there's no new markets are getting created on that false universe because people don't want to create markets on a universe that is previously resolved incorrectly. Meanwhile, the true coins will be worth something because it previously resolved correctly, and people want to create markets on that true universe. And so the idea here is that anyone who made a bet and then bet on the true reality or predicted the true reality correctly will then hold these true coins, and they can sell them to someone who then wants to bet on the next market down the line, right? And so these coins have value because they can be passed on to the next guy. The problem with this system that I've had in the past in general is that it feels very much like a hot potato game, where it's like, your coins are only valuable under the assumption that someone after you wants them. And this works for currencies. Like, so if you actually have a currency that people are using as a medium of exchange or something like that, it generally works. Like we see this with the US dollar, right? The US dollar is worth something, not because it actually has any intrinsic value, just because people believe they can use it to trade someone else in the future. And so these true universe tokens would be worth something because people believe they can trade them someone in the future. The problem I have with currencies is that there's a lot of competition in the currency space. Like already you have every nation in the world competing, and now you have all these blockchains competing in the currency space, and so it's highly competitive. And there's not really a lot of good reason to have more than one winner. Like it's very much a winner takes all or close to it game, right? And so USD currently is the winner, and the losers haven't all quit, but many of them have. Like you have countries that just accept that USD has won, and they just use USD. They don't even try their own currency anymore. So people do drop out of this game once they've lost enough. And while there are local network effects, and you have governments that use military power and police power to force their currency on population to keep from falling out of the game entirely. On the blockchain, we don't have the benefit of being able to just shoot people if they don't use our currency. And so we are stuck in the situation where our currency really needs to win, or at least needs to win a big market share, be different from other currencies in a significant way. And so Bitcoin and Ethereum both have different properties. And so there is some competition just in the sense that they serve slightly different audiences. But, again, there's not a lot of axes across which you can compete in that space. And so getting into the currency space is something I always want to avoid. And this is honestly the number one reason I haven't built my own blockchain at this point, is because I do not want to get into the currency competition space. And I haven't figured out a way to start a blockchain that doesn't have a built-in currency that needs to have this property of it's valuable because the next guy thinks it'll be valuable. And so this has always turned me off from colored coins. They have no kind of fundamental value outside of the system itself. It's good as long as there's some future market you can bet on. But if the future markets are starting to decline, you might expect that it's now harder and harder to sell these tokens because people have moved on to some other prediction market platform, or maybe prediction markets just kind of fall out of favor and people don't like betting anymore or something like that. And so it's harder. And you can imagine a scenario where you may win a bet, but you can't find anybody to sell your tokens to, and so you actually take a loss because you have to, sell them at a significant discount compared to what you bought them at, just in order to get rid of them. That being said, there are prediction markets out there that don't have any monetary value. You literally can't sell out. Like you can get in, but you can't get out, kind of thing. Or they just have a point system where it's just you get some free points to start out when you create your account, and then you can bet in there. So there's something to be said. This system could, in theory, work indefinitely. It's not the real money betting that I think a lot of us want to see. We want to see real money prediction markets that are backed by, something real, not just internet score or something like that. So that's the colored coin system. You just infinitely forking universes, and new markets are created on the one that had a history of all true, and anything that has a history of false in it probably gets no value. And it's a very elegant system. It works perfectly. There's no worry about parasitic open interests. It's great, except for that you can't get out. We can talk a little bit about how that may not be true later, but That's what I went into this thinking.
Well, you can get out. You just need somebody, some external system to provide finality for it. In some way.
So yeah, so you can. When I say you can't get out, in the sense that there are hypothetical scenarios where let's say you have a market and you bet on it and you win, and it's the last market to ever be created on that system, right? So it's the last one. No one's going to buy your winning coins, and so when I say you can't get out, there is a hypothetical scenario where there's no exit for you. Like you bought some coins from somebody who won the previous market, and now you're like, okay, I bet on this market and I win. I predicted. Maybe I had long odds, and I've got all the coins now, and no one wants them because there's no more markets created, and so there's no more use for them. They have no more utility, and so these coins don't have any utility externally.
Right.
So well, Augur.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, kind of like you said, it has that Ponzi-esque to it. Of you the last person standing.
Yeah, exactly. And that always made me uncomfortable. And this is why I have been generally against colored coins historically. So Augur had something very different, which is the bets were actually in Ether DAI, which has external value. So we don't have to build the currency. Someone else has a currency that we just use on our platform, or Augur uses in its platform, I should say. And so when you win a bet, you win Ether DAI. You don't win this token that may lose value over time. You win something that you care about externally. So even if this is the last market ever on Augur, hypothetically, and you win it, you still win something that is value. You can walk away and go spend that on a yacht or whatever it is that people spend money on. And so that's why Augur was designed that way instead of the colored coin system. Again, to be very clear, I really like a lot of the properties of the colored coin system. I think it's great, except for there's scenarios where the bettors don't have an exit. So this change I'm proposing to Augur is to make it so most of the time it is the kind of current Augur style where the bets are denominated in Ether DAI or something like that. When there's a fork, though, yeah, so bets are denominated in those red tokens.
So these are Ether DAI, and then this will be your rep.
Yeah.
Rep blue.
Yes, the red blue, exactly. And so when someone makes a bet, normally they're in Ether DAI, and everything behaves exactly like Augur does now. However, when it goes to a fork, instead of resolving, it converts everybody's rep or DAI in the system into two types of rep true and rep false, let's say. Or true is what actually happened, false is what didn't happen.
Right.
And it does so at a conversion rate that we can calculate, such that the people have as much rep now as they had Ether DAI before. And so the idea is at the current price at the time of the fork. And so if we know the price at the time of the fork of rep, we can then calculate how much rep we need to mint for these people. And the calculation is mildly complicated because we have to account for the fact that the rep supply is increasing. And so we make an assumption that the market cap is fixed, but so the market cap of rep is fixed, and we're increasing the supply. And so you do a little bit of math to figure out how much these tokens are worth. And so someone who had $100 bet on it now has $100 of rep after this fork occurs. Or sorry, has $100 of rep true or rep false, depending on which way they bet. We take that money and we actually give it to the rep holders directly because we need to do something with it. We don't want to just burn it. This is a huge waste of capital. And so we give it to the rep holders, and we also have to factor that into the price calculation. Again, the price calculation, I'm going to hand wave over it for now. But just suffice it to say that it is possible to estimate the value of rep after you take all this DAI and ETH, give it to the rep holders, and then mint a bunch of rep tokens and give it to the previous bettors. And then and under the assumption the bettors then go and sell it on the open market afterwards. And so the idea here is that these bettors that previously held those red circles, now they hold those blue circles, either T or F blue circles. They get made whole on the universe that is believed by the market to have value. We're making the assumption that the market in general will value those T tokens more than the F tokens, in theory, at 100% of the original market cap. And so if that is true, the bettors are made whole. The rep holders received all that ETH and DAI as kind of like a dividend, you could say, or whatever, however you want to describe it. My personal favorite is doing a buy and burn mechanism for distributing it, but it can be any number of mechanisms. You can do a dividend; it's just a little more computationally expensive. And so rep holders are generally happy, even though they got diluted by this minting of all this rep for those ETH and DAI holders. They got paid in ETH and DAI that amount, so everybody ends up the same. And what's nice here is Augur does not need to decide which one was true, which one was false. Augur just says, hey, you guys have these false tokens, you guys have these true tokens, go out on the internet and try to find someone to buy them. And we're assuming that the people will want to buy the true ones and will probably not want to buy the F ones. And again, this is an assumption that we're making. Go ahead. Okay, I had a question.
Yes. So you take the DAI that's here. Let's say, well, people are betting with, they're in Augur, they bet with the rep to show who won, or
no. So for reporting, they use the rep. For betting, it's all in ETH or DAI.
Right. Well, for reporting, I mean, so like in the rep, like in this case, like since it resolved, we're obviously in a forking scenario here, you would say like three-fifths of the rep went towards the wrong one and 2/5 went towards the right one, right?
Yeah, so for the actual lead up to the forks, we have an escalation game we play, so we minimize when how free forks happen. This only happens when the escalation game reaches the top, like the escalation game is at its final stage.
Yes.
Yeah. So if it resolves prior to that, then the system actually does assert this is true or this is false. It's only if it reaches the fork that it just throws up its hands kind of and says, you know what, I don't know what's true or false. Let the market decide. And so the rep at that point, anyone who had staked rep on during the escalation game will now have either rep true or rep false, depending on which way they staked. Right. So during the escalation game, they had to put stake behind their voice, and so they will have either rep true or rep false, and the winners will get the twice as much or whatever. I think 40% ROA. I think so. If you betted on rep T, you'll now have your bet times 1.4 in rep T, and the people who betted on rep F have 1.4 times their bet in rep F. And so those people are making. What's interesting here is we don't actually need everybody else to, once we hit the fork, the rest of the rep holders don't actually need to participate if they don't want to, which is very different than previous Augur. Now the rest of the rep holders, we just mint them for every token they had. We just mint them 1 T and 1 F, and that's it. And so the old rep becomes worthless. They now have either rep T or rep F. Or sorry, they have rep T and rep F, and they can go on the open market and sell one or the other of them, or neither. Right. So these are. What's interesting here is that once this fork is done, the system goes back to denominating everything in ETH or DAI or whatever your external token is. And so we are back to a situation where bettors are no longer having to bet on the future of rep. They only hold rep for this very small sliver of time around this fork, and they can liquidate it right away, in theory. And if they want to bet another market after that, it's back to ETH or DAI. So this has a really nice property of kind of gives us protection against parasitic open interest, because parasitic open interest is only a problem if Augur actually asserts a value, like true or false. It's not a problem if Augur throws up his hands and says, let the market decide. Because when those two billionaires are betting, right, they game the system or whatever because they've got billions of dollars in the line, and then they force it to a fork. And then in the end, the fork just says, hey, go figure it out yourself. go resolve your bet some other way, right? Some external layer 0 system. In this case, it's the market. And those billionaires could go and try to do market manipulation. But interestingly, if they do market manipulation, all they do is basically give people money. So anyone who had these F tokens, the person who's trying to manipulate the market to say that the F1, which is not true, what they'd have to do to do that is basically just buy up all of the rep F tokens off the market, like however many they can acquire, and then set a buy and sell price essentially on whatever pricing mechanism these billionaires are using for determining the outcome. And so they just basically give away a bunch of free money to anyone who holds rep F, which includes all the rep holders who didn't participate in the fork, plus anyone who bet on the incorrect outcome. Like those people get some free money, and yet the people who bet on true still get the payout they were expecting. So it's these billionaires are injecting a bunch of money into the system in this case, and that goes to the people who lost, but the people who won still make just as much as they planned on making originally. Their bets are still made whole, they still get paid out. And so these billionaires don't have a negative effect on the system. They can still game it, they can still manipulate it and whatnot, but it doesn't cause people who bet correctly to now lose money, nor does it cause people who
So like this, where does this go? Where does the ether DAI go? Let's say this is DAI.
So that just gets paid out to current rep holders right before the fork. So it just there's a number of ways to do this. You can do it in dividends. You can do a buy and burn system. Basically, the idea is it goes to rep holders, and that helps us
pay it out. So if there's 5 rep, it would just get split up into those 5.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
And then you would hope the market sort of figures it out later.
Yeah, and we can do reasonable estimates, so assuming things like efficient market and whatnot. We can do calculations to figure, okay, we know that the rep is about to be injected with some capital, and so therefore we assume that some amount of the rep market cap is already accounting for that capital in advance, and so we can deduct that from the market cap when we do our calculations for how much reps we need to mint for those people in order to make them whole. Right. Again, it's just a little bit of math is all. It's not particularly complicated.
Right, and for those
complicated assumption.
Yeah, and I remember from Edmund's talk, for those who haven't seen it, with this, there already are mechanisms in place to make sure that this isn't too big. Right.
Yes, and so so we can look at we have mechanisms for knowing what the current price of rep is denominated in the betting denomination token. So the price of rep in DAI in this case. That's something that's relatively easy to do with a TWAP over Uniswap market. It's not too complicated. Only thing you need to do is make sure that market has liquidity. And there's generally incentives to keep that market liquid. And you can add incentives in. So you can make it so, rep is automatically bought off that periodically or sold to it periodically, just to make sure there are arbitrage bots and whatnot that are just sitting there watching it. And so you can, even though Uniswap V2 is still old, it still is accurate because the arbitrage bots keep it on par with Uniswap V3 and SushiSwap and everywhere else. And so you just need to make sure there's kind of constant activity on it at some interval, so people are watching. That's all you really need, is someone to watch it. And as long as there's money to be made by watching it, people will watch it.
Nice.
And so we have those numbers, and so we can calculate all of this properly and get reasonably good estimates. And we can also do things like maybe mint an extra 5% for the bettors, just because in case, the market crashes out a little bit when they want to sell. We want to make sure they're whole. And this would be at a cost to the rep holders. And you can think of this as kind of like it's a minor punishment for failing to resolve before a fork. Like, we really wanted you to finish by the escalation games. We're going to give you a 5% punishment. We're going to give that punishment to the bettors to make sure that the bettors are made entirely whole, even if there's like a big sell pressure or something that causes the market to dip or something right there. And so there are things we can do to tweak the system like that. But that's generally the gist. So the key takeaway is that the system switches from the DAI denominating system to the colored coin system for a very brief moment in time. And then once that's done, then it goes back to the DAI denominating system. So that way rep has this intrinsic value in the sense that it's, fees, future DAI free fees, and it makes it so bettors aren't betting in some volatile coin most of the time. They are betting in a volatile coin a little bit during this fork period. But again, these should be rare, and it's a short sliver of time. It's not all the time.
Right. Super cool. And I mean, what happens, I guess, how do you envision if there's like 10 other markets open on this? Do they all sort of split as well?
Yeah, so the plan tentatively would be to do the same thing that Rep currently does, which is when there's a fork, all the markets fork together. And so every market, all those red circles you've got there, that represents literally all the currently open markets. So every open market, we take all the DAI from them and they all fork, even the ones that aren't part of this bet. Those
open markets denominated in DAI get transformed into rep.
Yes, they get transformed into rep, but in those markets, the holders get both rep T and rep F. And those markets now exist on both the rep T and rep F universes. And so they will then continue until their resolution on both those universes, though presumably no one cares about the one that's denominated in a token that's worthless. People do care about the one that's denominated in a token that's worth something. So there is a little bit of, one of the downsides of this is that for those other markets, let's say you have a fork and you've got some market that's got 6 months before it resolves, right? That market is denominated in rep for the next 6 months, or rep T and rep F. And so those people do have an open position on rep. There are some things you can do to try to mitigate this. Like you can make it so kind of DeFi Legos type things where you can make it so people can sell that volatility risk to someone else while keeping their positions open, for example. They're a little more complicated, but I think all that can be built on top of Augur, and it doesn't need to actually be baked into the system. So the system itself can just deal with this. Yeah, the market's denominating rep for until it ends. It's unfortunate. Luckily, forks are very rare, and so this shouldn't happen very often. And so we're kind of confident that it's not that big of a deal. But you never know of these things, of course.
Yeah. Okay. I think I get it, and this is super cool. The next question would be, obviously, Augur, in here and kind of after, even if you ignored the parasitic problem before, it would always work as these sort of self-closed-in systems. But now,
Yep.
now you see people starting to want to take this subjectivity of forking and put it into things that, say, need a little bit of finality, such as, like if you looked at Edmund's reality.eth or Backstop, where like you eventually want to bridge these assets out, right? You eventually want to have a settled market.
Yep.
How do you sort of see people using this in any way, or how do you see any of these mechanisms working out over the long term?
I have yet to be convinced that any of those systems can actually work, is my net takeaway. Yeah. So the closest we got to a system that guarantees finality was Augur, but it had the giant parasitic open interest problem. So either you have the open interest problem or you don't have finality. Like those are the only two solutions to this problem that I've seen anyone propose that are actually workable. Even reality.eth, I give Edmund lots of credit. I think the design is generally good, but I don't think there's a solution to that last little bit, which is how do you get those assets that are forked bridged out? Like there is no finality. You can do things like, there might be clever things you can do with regards to like DeFi Lego tricks where you can basically, I don't know, maybe sell the risk or something. But I'm very skeptical. Like I think reality.eth works as long as you don't have bridged assets. Like I think colored coin systems, speaking of which, so part of figuring this whole thing with Augur out, it kind of led me to believe that colored coin systems actually can work reasonably well. I think I was wrong previously when I believed that they didn't work because they crashed. They would eventually crash to zero. But so one could build an L2, for example, that had a forking system, had its own internal economy and whatnot. And as long as everything stays in that L2, then it's fine. And you can even have people, buy into the L2 and sell out of the L2. So you have some way to bridge, but the bridge is by buying and selling in and out of it. What I'm not convinced of is that there's actually a way to bridge things into it, in the sense of you take your ETH over in L1 and you move it over to the L2, because the L2 is designed to fork. And once the L2 forks, someone has to decide, which fork has ETH that's worth something. And that's much harder to solve with the market. Maybe you can. I'm just very skeptical about being able to solve that problem.
Well, you would almost have to have like, well, this is the Uniswap pool it's going to resolve on, and then it,
Yeah, but so as soon as you define a shelling point for how you resolve, you're back to solving the problem of an oracle, and you have parasitic open interest problem now again, because you can with enough money you can manipulate a Uniswap TWAP for as long as you need, given enough money. Given infinite money, you can manipulate it for however much time you need. The upper end of the manipulation is basically the entire market cap of the thing you're trying to manipulate. So take Augur, for example. It's got 11 million tokens. Let's say they're worth $10. And so you got $110 million in market cap. If you're willing to spend $110 million, you can literally just buy everything that's available on the market up to the current price. So sorry, let's say you fork these two. So you have rep true, rep false, and one of the two is worth $110 million. You only need the other one that everybody thinks is worth zero. You need that to be worth $111 million to make people think that it's worth more, right? And so one can imagine simply setting a infinite size buy order at $11 instead of $10, and people will sell into that because, hey, this thing worthless. I don't want rep false, and so they sell the rep false. They sell the rep false, and so for whatever 11 times 11 is, $121 million, something like that. I'm not good at math. Don't trust me on any math stuff. For that much money, you can make rep false be worth more than rep true. And there's nothing someone can do to stop you other than throwing money at rep true to pump its value. And so maybe you can try pumping rep true value, but there's a good chance that a lot of people, when they start seeing this happen, may actually just exit the whole system. And so rep true value may actually go down, which lowers your cost. There's also the issue that if you do this, if you buy slowly over time, rep false starts as worthless. And so you can probably buy a very large amount of it for pennies on the dollar. and you only need to actually buy the last, million at your target price. And so the actual cost ends up being significantly lower. But from like a game theoretic standpoint, we can just model it as epsilon dollars more than the market cap of the true universe is the cost to manipulate it. So if you have these two billionaires betting, and they're betting billions of dollars, and the rep market cap is $100 million, then for them it's financially worth it to just throw $100 million at rep false, and then lock its TWAP in for however long you're watching that TWAP, whether it's a month or a year or whatever, it doesn't matter. All they have to do is sit there, right? They've already spent the money, the $100 million. They just have to literally just sit there and just keep the buy order open. And eventually there's no one left to buy. And so their buy order stops getting filled and they stop draining money after a while. And then they cause the market to resolve however they want. And so the core issue here is that as soon as you have a Schelling point for what you're resolving on, which is necessary for any kind of contract or automated system to resolve, it needs to know in advance what are the terms for resolution. Like this is a TWAP from this point in time to this point in time, for example. This is the duration. This is the where we look. We look at Uniswap V2 or whatever, or the Sushi swap, like whatever you're looking at and whatever time duration, that tells the person attacking the system exactly where they need to attack. And again, anybody that is just assuming that the market will be honest should not do so. The market will be profitable. And if there's billions of dollars of open interest, the market's going to do the profitable thing and cheat. So yeah, I'm very skeptical that you could actually do bridging. Again, everything else about ETH, I agree.
I think like what you could do. So like obviously, if you were to build Augur, if you were a VC and I was going to build Augur today, I would make this an app chain, right, or a roll up. So you would say it's a roll up, sure. And you would have the prediction market over here. But then you have the problem of eventually they want to bridge the ETH back, right? Yeah. Eventually. So like maybe, and this is where like Edmund's thing comes in, like maybe I guess if this was the bridge contract, it converts all your ETH, market sells it into roll up, resolve true, roll up, resolve false kind of thing. Like roll one, and then you could potentially have like two tokens, right? Maybe.
Sure. So if the person is, it depends on what you mean by bridging. If what you mean by bridging is someone puts some ETH into a contract on L1, and in exchange they get some not ETH over on L2, and that not ETH can fork, and then later you can sell not ETH true or not ETH false to someone who wants to buy ETH back on L1, that's fine. But the problem is that ETH that you locked up when you bought your not ETH over on L2, that's the ETH that you want to unlock eventually, right? And the question is who do you give that ETH to over on L1 that's locked in a contract? Who do you give it to? Do you give it to the guy that shows up with a rep true? Do you give it to the guy that shows up with a rep false? Or do you give it to the guy that shows up with both, maybe a pair of rep true and false? If they show up with a pair, then you could say, yes, we'll give you the ETH. And so maybe that's the way it's solved. But now you've got like a market for false. Like false now has value. And the game theory suggests that if I have rep true and you have rep false, and my rep true is, let's say, worth $1, right? But the only way I can get that dollar out is if you work with me. The game theory suggests that you should. So this is actually a very interesting problem in psychology. The game theory suggests that you should pay me. You should be willing to accept my purchase offer of your rep false for like 1 penny, right? Because, right, it's worthless to you, but it's worth something to me. And so you should sell it to me for a penny and then I'll go exit. In reality, people will not sell that thing unless it's an even split. And this is called the ultimatum game, as well studied in psychology. It baffles psychologists because it's totally irrational. Like you should not do it. People will actually turn down money, real money. This has been done with real money. People will turn down real money if they feel like they're getting an unfair deal. And these people feel like they're getting an unfair deal anytime they're not getting the same amount as someone else, because especially if they think that neither person worked for it. And so, like in the ultimatum game, the way it's usually played is the person running the game gives one person like $10, and they say, you can keep this $10, whatever portion of this $10 you agree with this other person on keeping. And so one person has the $10. And they have to convince the other person, they say, actually, I should take that back. So the real study is an ultimatum game, actually blind both sides so that they don't work with each other. It's usually both players playing against a computer, but they're told they're playing with a human. And the way it works out is the person that is getting offered the money from the other player will only accept if they get about 50%. And interestingly, the people doing the offer seem to know this because they generally offer about 50%, which I find also interesting. Like they don't do the greedy thing and say only offer a penny, even though that the game theory says that's what they should offer. But maybe, I guess, humans just know other humans, and they know that the offer's not going to be accepted unless they offer half. And so they offer half, and everybody ends up walking away with half the money, and it works out. It's like an interesting equilibrium in human psychology that no one really understands.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, so we see a lot of these systems being built right now in crypto, where kind of like the prediction market problem is the same as in general. It's like the proof of stake problem. Anytime you have these like honest majority assumptions, they kind of fail with parasitic open interest unless you have an ability to fork and rely on a social layer, right?
Yep.
But like, how do you see that playing out? Because like most people aren't relying on a social layer. Like we don't build delays like this to wait for a social layer resolution. We just sort of always assume honest majority. Right.
Yeah, any system that assumes honest majority, I'm generally pretty vocally against. I think honest majority assumptions are generally bad. This actually is something that bugs me a lot about Ethereum lately, is that people treat Ethereum like it's an honest majority assumption, but it's very much not an honest majority assumption. Ethereum is designed specifically under the assumption that the social layer wins. And so even if you have the majority of stake is malicious or owned by some malevolent actor, it doesn't matter because all the real users will just stick to the chain that is reality, like aligns with reality or aligns with the rules, whatever, didn't cheat. And so the problem I've seen lately with Ethereum is that people forget that Ethereum is not an honest majority because they hear these things like, okay, we got the 66% problem and the 50% problem and the 25% problem with Ethereum stakers that create various things. And in their heads, people kind of turn this into, oh, Ethereum's assuming a 66% honest majority. And no, it just means that it loses liveness for a while if you have more than 33% defect. Or if it's you get over 66% defect, then you get an invalid chain finality on the wrong chain. And that's very bad. But again, the social layer should win in that case. And so it doesn't matter if 66% were wrong of the stakers. What matters is what the actual rules are. And so people see this and they're like, oh, Ethereum is assuming 66% honest majority. So let's just use that 66% honest majority and bake it into our system and say, okay, we assume that 66% of stakers are honest because Ethereum already assumes that. So it's already baked into our whole thought process. And they go and design these big complicated systems that are all dependent on a 66% honest majority. And I keep telling people, no, Ethereum is not 66% honest majority. Your whole system falls apart because you do not have like that core assumption that you had that there's an honest majority here is not true. Ethereum needs like a 1%, honest majority. I mean, technically you need more than zero. Like if you have actually zero stakers that are honest, you do actually have some real problems. Like the whole chain just halts, for example. But you don't need many. And there's, again, as you approach that 0%, you get problems like you won't see a block on the honest chain. You won't see a block for, hours or months, potentially, as you get down to that last staker.
Well, I mean, how fast would you inactivity leak everyone out?
It takes, if I remember correctly, it takes it's either weeks or a month to inactivity leak enough people out. Yeah. So like if you actually have a real fork, I think it takes weeks to a month. I don't remember the exact timing. Before the two chains now are independent of each other. Like they basically are in this leaking state for quite a while. And then eventually you get to two separate chains at the end. It's a very long process. And if one of those chains only has one validator with 32 ETH staking, and he's the honest one, right? And the other, however many millions of ETH are being staked on the dishonest one, that one guy, he gets to produce a block every couple of months, right? And so you're just sitting, he's waiting for his turn. He's like, nope. Everybody missed. No, he missed, he's missed. And he doesn't see anybody else because he's on his own little fork there. But he's the honest one. So everybody's following him. All the real users are following this one guy who's got his one validator running. And eventually he'll produce a block. And eventually you'll see one block. So Ethereum will grind down to one block every month or two as this one lonely validator waits for everybody else to leak out. And eventually, and then there's other problems like the actual leaking out can only happen when blocks are really actually produced, like the actual exiting. Right. Like exit queue. And I'm not an expert in this, but that may also introduce problems. Basically, when you get down to really small numbers of validators, things just kind of fall apart. But you can get down to like 10% or 1%, and things will hobble along. Like, you're missing 9 out of 10 blocks, but you are getting blocks on a fairly regular basis. The system can kind of work. It can hobble forward. But this introduces other problems with things like we have like sharding and splitting the data up amongst validators and whatnot. And they do things like, okay, we have this much redundancy planned for these various systems, but now we're creating, again, we started with this assumption that one lonely honest validator can keep the chain running, sort of. Like, they can hobble along and make it work. But if the data is sharded across a bunch of people and no one validator has all the data, you no longer have that guarantee. And so you're taking that, the chain technically could hobble along with one guy, and now you're saying, okay, well, now actually we need 20% of people to be honest, and that's a much bigger number than one guy needs to be honest. And so you go from this single person honest, ish small number of honest people to 20%. That's already a huge jump. And so this is why I'm very often vocal about these things, and I dislike these building these systems on this assumption that stakers are honest. And it's like, oh, they're incentivized to be honest. No, they're incentivized to follow their incentives. And if all your stakers are in the US and the US says all stakers now need to stake on this fork or you're being thrown in prison, then what are we going to see? Are we going to see are there enough stakers in countries that don't throw stakers into prison that it can hobble along with assumptions of 66% honest? And I'm not convinced of that.
Well, I mean, also like kind of back to the Augur thing, like these pieces work when it's much more self-contained and you can sort of fork off into these 1%. Yep. But a lot of people have said, like, anytime you bring on, say, real world data with an Oracle, or especially real world assets, like say USDC, is your fork choice less? Like do you not have that ability anymore, or just because all of the value is sort of tied to, say, a handful of actors? And like, what should be done to sort of prevent that? I mean, the thing that I do personally is I just don't hold USDC or anything denominated in external assets. And that's what I recommend to everybody else. Is like, I have a little bit of USDC just because it's safer than putting it in a bank. And it's just a low bar to beat. So it's safer than a bank. And, in case I'm wrong about this whole crypto thing working out, I want to make sure I have a little bit of money left over and don't have to immediately go scrounging for the first job I can find. I want, to be able to survive for a month or two while I go find work, in case crypto just completely collapses. And so I'm not going to lie and say I have no USDC, but I have a little bit. And, but again, it's just a hedge on my bets. And I'm very worried about this exact problem you described, where the US government is really the one to worry about, because that's where most of these big companies are, like Circle and whatnot. If the U.S. government decides, similar to Tornado Cash, that the Circle people are all criminals one day, they're all terrorist financiers or something, and they throw them all in jail, what happens? What if the government, instead of saying that, they just go to Circle and say, you need to now, or go to Coinbase, I guess, and say, you need to stake on this fork or we're throwing you all in prison. Like, it is illegal to stake on the true fork, and we're compelling you to stake on the false fork, and you're under a gag order or something. So all Coinbase can do, their only option, if they don't want to all go to prison, is start staking all the ETH that's staked with them on some Lie universe or Lie fork. And so in those situations, if the market just follows Circle and Coinbase, then that's not great because it means that they're following whatever the US government says. They're not following truth or reality or the rules anymore. They're just doing, we're back to the same system we started with. Whereas you got some people who just make up some rules randomly and wantonly and apply them, and everybody's kind of blindly follows along, and you end up in a dystopia in the end. The hope is that people will not blindly follow Circle and Coinbase. And so if Circle and Coinbase get compelled, Circle and Coinbase lose a lot of money. People holding USDC, unfortunately, probably lose a lot of money. But hopefully, the rest of the system doesn't. Or maybe the people holding USDC, in an optimistic case, the people holding USDC, so let's say US government goes after all the US validators, and there's enough of them, they can force a fork. They force a fork and they tell Circle, you must only redeem USDC on the fork that we decided, which is the Coinbase and US actor fork. In theory, people who have USDC could go redeem their USDC on the untrue fork and then use that to go buy ETH on the fork that they actually think is correct. And so there is kind of a way out for users in that scenario, where if the market decides on something
if the market as seen by centralized exchanges, which are only allowed to list assets, let's say, on the wrong universe, you could imagine that there's a way for users to then exit that and then go join the right one. And so all that means is, Circle and Coinbase and whatever go out of business because everybody just fled. And that's the kind of the optimistic case. Hard to say until it actually happens. We don't know. And that's the big risk with all of this, I think, is that you never know. And I think my biggest worry is that the number of people I see in the space still that care about this ethos of preventing global totalitarianism and financial privacy and ending financial surveillance and all these things, relative to the number of people that are just looking to make a lot of money on volatile assets, is very small. Like, there's not a lot of people in the ecosystem who seem to really care about those fundamental tenets that crypto is kind of built on. And so it's hard to say. I could be very wrong, and it could be that everybody just says, you know what, we're going to just go with Circle and Coinbase because that's where I trade. That's where I do my day trading, and I don't want to go hold ETH over on this other thing that's hard to get access to because I have to go down to Mexico in order to acquire it or something.
I think running your own node would be enough of a hassle. But
that's another issue. I mean, don't get me started on node operation centralization. I mean, there's like 3 node operators in the world right now, I think.
There's 4. We got one in our office.
Okay, there you go. So we're up to 4. We'll say there's probably a 5th one in one of the developers somewhere. Probably has one.
Yeah, no, but I think it kind of leads me. The one thing I definitely wanted to ask. I don't know how you are in time, but just give me a 5 minutes.
No rush.
But we had, whenever you're looking at these honest majority assumptions or even these forking universes, a lot of times, like, what happens is people want to use them. So, like, like a lot of, like, I built oracles, and other people, like Eigenlayer is talking about we're going to use subjective forking or intersubjective forking for oracles and things like that. How do you see a user actually using these? Like if you add forking, because like we've had the problem of anytime, like if you're able to fork, the problem is that now your user has to basically have a multi-sig or a social layer able to pick a fork in your oracle, right? And that's not good, because if you're, say, immutable and perfectly trustless, now you're basically just pushing the hard social decision onto a user who's even probably farther down the stack.
Yep. This is definitely a very real problem. One of the big advantages of having these escalation games is that if the threat is credible, that we will do this subjectivity fork, there's a good chance you'll never need to actually execute it. And so that's kind of the one plus side. If you can make that threat so credible that no one wants to bother attacking the system because it's just too expensive, it's just a waste of money, and it's not going to work, then you can kind of avoid having to do it. That being said, you still need, in order for it to be credible, you need to build all the UI and UX around what would happen in a social fork so that it's believable that users would actually end up on the true universe. And that's actually, you're right, that's a very hard problem. The way I imagine it working, and I'll say how I imagine it working, and then I'll go into why that probably isn't reality in a second. But the way I imagine it working is, if you have forks and they're fairly infrequent, when a fork occurs and the user goes back to your user interface, they just get prompted with the question, and they say, what happened on this date? Did Trump win or did Biden win? Did sports team A win or sports team B win? Whatever the bet that caused the fork was, you simply ask the user. And then the user chooses one, and then the UI then just assumes for them, they show them, that true universe. And if someone chooses the other one, they show them the false universe. And it's okay. And there are situations where true and false are fuzzy, where it may be that half the people legitimately believe that one thing happened, and half the people legitimately believe that the other thing happened. And these subjectivity systems allow that. They say, okay, you go live over here, you guys go live over there. You both play in your own sandboxes, and the sandboxes don't interact at all. They're just two separate places. And so now you have the sports team A fans over here and all sports team B fans over there, who apparently, or maybe, one of the channels showed, sports team A winning, and a different channel on TV showed sports team B winning. And so you have people who watch channel A in one universe and people who watch channel B in another universe. or whatever it was that caused this split. You basically just separate those groups, and you tell them you each play in your own little sandboxes with each other. And more than likely, one of those groups is going to be bigger than another one, but it is theoretically possible that the groups are equal sized. And so that's kind of the ideal scenario. And so you have very infrequent forks. If a fork occurs, you ask the users which thing they believe happened, and then from then on, they just see that as their universe. And there's ways to allow the user to switch if they want, maybe a drop down or something buried in a setting somewhere, or clearing your cache or something, and you get prompted again. The problem here is that, as we saw with Augur, and this is one of the biggest things with Augur, is that users, with oracles in general, there's this very big disagreement in the community of whether you should go with a technical truth or the spirit truth. Like when someone says, did X happen? And everybody kind of knows that X happened, but then when you read the details of the market, it specifies, okay, X happened if this specific thing occurred. And so one can imagine, using recent events, the SEC approval of the ETH ETF, and the SEC approved it, but they didn't go through their normal approval process. And so if you had a market that said, will the SEC approve ETH ETF? And then in the technical details, it describes what it means for the SEC to approve the ETH ETF, right? And what it means is they need to file this form with this department, and it needs to be made public on this website or something like that. And the SEC didn't do those steps yet. At least at the time the market resolved, those steps were not completed. But the SEC did release an announcement that said, ETH ETF is approved. And so the spirit of the market is that the SEC approved the ETF. But the technicality of the market is the SEC did not approve the ETF. And there is a substantial portion of people that believe that the market should resolve in the spirit, even if technically it didn't match. And there's a substantial portion of people that believe that, no, the technicalities really matter, and this is how we make a prediction market actually work. If you just go with the spirit, then it starts to get really fuzzy really fast. And so this is why it's not obvious that subjectivocracy will actually work, because when you just prompt someone with a question that says, did the SEC approve the ETF? And then here's 3 paragraphs of fine print they should read. Most people are just going to read that top line and then be like, oh yeah, they did. Like, yes. And they go into that universe. They didn't actually read the fine print. And so ideally you want rules lawyers or whatever to go and, read all the fine details and debate and engage with each other, people that care about these things and they're willing to spend lots of time on it. And those guys, decide. And then maybe you have users just say, I want to follow, person A, or I want to follow person B. Whatever person B says, I trust them, or whatever person A says, you trust them. And so you can imagine making it so instead of individual users deciding, users can just subscribe to a particular trusted party of their own. And so this is, what was that?
Delegate your fork choice.
Exactly. You delegate your fork choice to someone else who you trust. And this generally works because, in theory, it doesn't allow a centralized actor to take control of things. The problem is that very quickly it can turn into a popularity contest. And popularity contests, as we know, do not produce the best results. See U.S. presidential elections right now for what the end game for popularity contests is. It's not a pretty sight. And so, to be fair, I shouldn't be quite that pessimistic. To be fair, the problem with the U.S. is that it's popularity contest limited to 2 people, like 2 candidates, effectively, just due to the way it works. In this case, everybody can choose their own, and there's no limit, and so you just choose who you trust. And so it's actually significantly better than the U.S. Election system.
But I mean, like we deal with this in price, price feed land too. Like whenever people are, I know most oracles don't have any slashing mechanisms, so it's a low bar to clear. But you could, the problem always comes in when you're picking a price, like is a price like the price of Bitcoin, you can just say that, or you could say like, I want the median at these 3 exchanges. And those are, based on the API of 3 exchanges, which, then it's very easily to attack, because you just have to take down 3 APIs, but then you're not slashable. Like, so it's weird. And I don't necessarily know. And do you have to so if you're building a stable coin, for instance, let's say, like how would you actually see that work? Where let's say you have an oracle that's trying to do the right thing. Do you have a more technical specification, or do you build in the ability to fork within your stable coin, or should the oracle have the ability to fork and you can just pick the fork? I don't know.
So I think for a stablecoin, because generally speaking, the purpose of stablecoin is a medium of exchange, and so they're only useful if everybody agrees on which one to use. And so getting everybody to agree on the one to use is actually significantly more important than getting it right. Like getting the stablecoin price exactly right within reason. If you're off by 5%, that matters far less than if you have a split. Like splitting is much worse than just being a little bit off on your price feed read. I mean, being off on your price feed read is not great, but it's better than having a stablecoin that isn't universally available, like just two forks of it. Like if imagine you go to a retailer, they're like, oh, we only accept die A. Sorry, you have die B. We can't sell you anything.
I can't wait.
That's not useful. It's kind of like the pathologically worst case for a currency is that, I mean, it's kind of the real world, right? Like, oh, you have euros. Sorry, we only accept USD. Like all of a sudden you're like, well, I thought I got this thing because it was accepted everywhere. But now you're telling me that I go across one little ocean, now it's not accepted anymore. What's up with that, right? And so it's certainly not an ideal situation. And the more risk there is to forking, you might fork more often. So now if you've got die A, B, C, and D as all possibilities, or A, B, C, D, E, F, G, I guess, you have all these 8 possibilities because it forked twice on each branch. It's not really a good situation for stablecoins. So for stablecoins, I think agreement is more important. So like shelling systems are, they have lots of problems and they're very attackable. I'm not a fan of shelling systems, but there's something to be said for, some amount of shellingness in them. Like you don't want them to be super attackable. Maybe you can mitigate it so you're mostly using a shelling system within some boundaries or some margin of error, right? Where you say, okay, so we're taking 5 feeds and this is what some people do, right? They'd say we take 5 feeds, we drop the outliers, and then we median the last 3 or mean the last 2 or something like that. Or I'll take 10 feeds and drop outliers. And the idea there is that it's not guaranteeing that this price is going to be exactly correct. It's just guaranteeing that we come to an agreement, which is more important. And the agreement is probably close. That being said, I'm not really a fan of current stablecoins at all. I do have a design for a stablecoin that's unfinished. Would you like the short version of that?
You give me the TLDR, and then you can come back on whenever you finish.
Sure.
You can present.
Well, so I wrote about it a long time ago, and I still haven't finished it. So it's unlikely to be finished. Let's see if I can pull it up here. When you've got something that's very close to the cost of energy to generate, and the capex for buying the hardware is negligible relative to the cost of energy. That's kind of the ideal system. You can kind of drive this price to about the cost of electricity. And we see this with Bitcoin. We're pretty close, right? The cost to mine a Bitcoin is slightly lower than the value of a Bitcoin when the difficulty equalizes. So when there's big spikes in the price of Bitcoin, the difficulty lags behind, but eventually the difficulty catches up. And then it gets back to the place where mining a Bitcoin costs about as much as a Bitcoin is worth. And so this is information that we can get on chain in theory without any sort of oracle. And so once you have the price of electricity, now you can say, okay, well, let's make a token that is stable against that price. Instead of trying to be stable against USDC, you're stable against price of electricity. And to me, that's actually much more interesting than USDC because the price of electricity is kind of a more fundamental unit of value. Like these days, you can make almost anything out of electricity. Like given enough electricity, you can fabricate things. You can run 3D printers. You can run concrete plants. Like most things require some amount of electricity to operate or power. And so electricity, I suspect, is going to be long-term fairly stable against a certain quality of life, which I think is ultimately what people want with a stablecoin. They want to know that my quality of life, if I've got $1,000 and it costs me $100 a month to live, then I can live for 10 months. And they don't want that to fluctuate a lot. If you have the ability, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I feel like the thing here is like you can still manipulate it, right?
So you can, you can get a lower bound. You can get an upper bound, I think. I always forget which one's which, but you can manipulate it by throwing money away at driving the price feed lower, but you can't drive it higher. Like there's people will join as long as if the cost to generate a Bitcoin, is ever higher than significantly higher than the cost of electricity to mine the Bitcoin, then people will join in, and this is why we see the difficulty go up, right? Because people join in because there's free money there. Let's throw some hardware at that problem, and it will drive the price back down. And so I believe that gives you an upper bound on the price.
Which would you do like a Terra Luna attack where you like drive, where you blow a ton of money, driving the price of electricity really, really low, and then you mint a bunch, right? mint a bunch of electric coins.
Yeah.
And then you tank the market, right? That would be
this is why I say it's unfinished, because it only gives you one of the two bounds. It doesn't give you both bounds. And so that being said, I do believe that there are ways in theory to get the other second bound out of the first bound. They involve basically, you want people in the market to do long-term predictions of the future value of the coin. And so basically, if you give people a way to both short and long the asset, separate from the mining side of things, then those people will see the attacker, driving the price down, but they know the price is eventually going to go back to where it was once the attack ends, because the attacker doesn't have infinite money. They can't suppress the price forever. And so those people then start buying in more and more as they see this occurring, to basically real-time combat the attack. And so I think in theory, you could do some, DeFi Lego stuff that I know people love to do and design a system that gets a lower bound once you have just that upper bound. So once you have that upper bound, you can then, I think, get a lower bound via some complicated, long and short positions and leverage and all these things, and then attracting all those people that love to play with those systems into playing with it. And then you have both an upper bound and a lower bound, because you got some range which they can be profitable. And then your stable coin, the other thing is with stable coins is, I'm not a fan of pegged coins. I'm much more a fan of stable coins, which I think what people really want, but they don't understand that's what they want, and so they look for pegged coins. Stable coin is something more like RAI, where the price can fluctuate. It's not fixed to some external asset. It's just stable against volatility. And so it's unlikely to move a lot at once. It'll slowly move. And so again, if you've got $1,000 and your monthly bill is $100, monthly bills are $100, you just want confidence that you can go about 10 months. If you can only go 9 months sometimes, you can go 11 months sometimes, that's probably fine. You just want confidence that you're not going to be out on the street tomorrow. Whereas if you're holding Bitcoin, you might be out on the street tomorrow, or you might be a millionaire tomorrow. Who knows? And it's when people want stable coins, I think they want to get rid of that volatility specifically. Right. And so with something like this electric coin, I would do something that's more stable. So you're doing like a long-term trajectory target of that price. So if someone does try to manipulate it, it doesn't matter, because you're a stable asset, which is again just derived from the price of electricity or price feed, is only just slowly targeting that price feed. And so even if someone does manipulate the market for a week or whatever, you still have your stable asset, which is just slowly trailing towards it. And so maybe you get like a 5% decrease in value due to the attack or something like that.
Nice. Yeah. No, I mean, one of the last things I kind of wanted to ask you was more on one of the recent things. It's it really ties into a lot of this, but it was actually your views on ossification of Ethereum, kind of in general. Mm-hmm. Which I guess if you want to just kind of summarize that, and then how do you feel about kind of ossification of all of the protocols on top of Ethereum, and whether it's rollups in general or apps even just deployed?
So the very, very short answer is, I think everything should ossify and be immutable. And if you want to build new things, that's totally fine and cool. And I encourage everybody to do that, but they should be new things. You should not have old things become new things, which is the world we live in. Is very much things self-upgrade, especially software. And we're used to this. Like your Facebook upgrades without your consent all the time. Like it's getting updates daily. Whereas I'm much more of a fan of kind of the car model. When you buy a car, you have the same car for the life of that car. Like however long that car can last, you get that same car. The car dealer can't come in and start installing new features in your car that may or may not break it. They can't, take the car from you. Can't make the car stop working. I'm very much a fan of the car analogy and not the Facebook analogy, just in general in life. And I think this becomes more and more important the more fundamental your protocol is. So like the lower down the stack you get, the more critical it is that things become immutable. And in fact, I take this all the way to the social layer, and where it's absolutely critical that the social layer has agreed upon norms that are very stable, because that's what everything else is built on top of. And so this is when I talk about ossification, I also often will ask me, it's like, oh, well, the social layer can ultimately make the decision. And my response is, the social layer is where the ossification needs to occur. We need to agree this is the ethos of Ethereum. Write it down somewhere if necessary, but we need general agreement amongst the people who use Ethereum that if you're getting into Ethereum, you agree that this is the kind of the ethos of the system. And so if we do a social fork, it will be towards that ethos specifically. The US has their constitution, which fills this void role very well. So like the higher layers are somewhat mutable, but that lowest layer, in theory, the Constitution, is hypothetically immutable. It can't be changed, or at least very hard to change. And so anything that changes above that still needs to at least follow the ethos of the Constitution. Again, in theory, I'm not confident it's still holding very strongly, but it's in theory it works, right?
Let's just pretend like 200 years. It was a good run.
Yeah, 200 years, it's a good run. I mean, it's certainly not the best run that a government's had, but it's better than many. Solid. And so for Ethereum, I guess the other thing for ossification is that any system that has power, like power to, make money or change the way people act or anything like that. So some sort of power. It can be soft power, it can be hard power, whatever it is. Anything that has power will eventually be captured by those who are most interested and willing to leverage that power. You can do things to slow down the rate of capture, but capture is inevitable. And when I say capture, just for clarity for anyone listening, I don't mean the malevolent cabal of people in robes in a secret dungeon making decisions for the world. I mean...
That's the EF, right?
Right. I do not think of capture in that way of discrete people. Capture, from what I've noticed, capture of systems tends to be very diffuse. And while it's easy to describe it as, oh, those evil people at the FDA, have, or in pharma, have captured the FDA, in reality, it's just a bunch of incentives and a bunch of individuals following incentives. And if you ask any individual one of them, they'll probably tell you honestly that they believe they're doing the right thing. There's no one person here who is just, sitting in the dark and running their fingers together and saying, I'm going to capture the FDA. No one's doing that. They all think they're doing the right thing. But the incentives have driven them to, in aggregate, do this very pathological thing. Same thing with the SEC. As much as I'm not a Gensler fan, he probably honestly believes he's doing the right thing. Like, he believes whatever the right thing means to him. Now, I might not agree with him what the right thing is, but I don't think he's being necessarily malevolent. And I could be wrong on this. I'm sure there are malevolent people out there. But when systems gets captured, it's not because you have 100 malevolent people working together to capture it. You just have a bunch of people doing things that the incentives tell them to do, and that leads to negative outcomes. And so we can start to see this in Ethereum, where you have A16Z got into the client development game, right, with Breath, I believe, right? And so, or maybe it's Paradigm. Anyways, one of these VCs somewhere decided they want to build a client. And part of the reason they want to build a client is because, they wanted a voice at the table. And the way to get a voice at the table in the Ethereum core dev calls is to build a client. And so you get a voice at the table. I don't think they're trying to capture Ethereum. I don't think they're actively seeking, okay, we want to turn development into our favor. They're just like, you know what? I have some ideas, and I think these ideas would be beneficial to Ethereum. And I want to be able to voice those ideas in a way that has a little more oomph to it. And so we're going to throw some money at building a client, and now we will have a voice at the table. We can now contribute our ideas to the broader group. Everything about this is perfectly fine and normal. I mean, that's kind of what we want people to do, right? We want people to, hey, help us out, build a client, contribute to the development of Ethereum, and you get a louder voice, and we'll listen to you more. The problem is that A16Z or Paradigm, or whoever it is that's building Reth, they're not necessarily building on Ethereum because they want censorship resistance and they want financial privacy. They're building on Ethereum because they like money and they're making lots of money and they want to make more money. And I don't have a problem with them wanting to make money. I don't necessarily need them to agree with my ethos. The problem, though, is now we have, where previously we had 10 core developers building clients. Now we have 11, and one of those cares about money, and 10 of those care about censorship resistance and financial privacy and all these things. Then someone else comes in, and they, build a client, they join the seat at the table, and they also want money. So I have 2 to 10. And one of those 10 has been doing it for 20 years, and so they drop out of the race. They're like, you know what, I'm done, I'm out. I don't want to work on Ethereum anymore. And so I have 9 to 2. And this is a very slow process, but we do see it occurring. And it's just the people who are coming into the core devs don't have the same ethos as the people who are leaving the core devs for Ethereum. And eventually you'll get to a point where the ethos in aggregate has moved very significantly from censorship resistance and financial privacy and banking the unbanked and these kind of core principles. And now it's more about, well, how can we make sure this thing gets seen favorably by regulators? Because the people that are developing the clients are people from places like A16Z and Paradigm and VCs and whatnot, and they're not as interested in making it so Tornado Cash can work. They're interested in making sure the regulators don't get mad at the whole blockchain when someone builds Tornado Cash. And so again, it's no one here is malicious. I'm not mad at it. People building Reth, I don't think they're doing a bad thing. Many of them might actually be ethos aligned, some portion of them. But my guess is that in aggregate, the Reth developers are probably not as ethos aligned as like Peter and Martin, or the original Geth team. And it's just, again, it's a slow process, but you can kind of see it happening, and it's like watching a slow train wreck when you predict it's going to happen. And this is where I start shouting into the wind, and I'm like, we need to ossify Ethereum because we need to lock in that ethos before it's too late to lock in the ethos. Unfortunately, I kind of suspect it's already too late.
But like kind of like you said, like if the ethos get captured, whether you're ossified or you're still doing upgrades or not, if your social layer is captured, your social layer is captured.
Yes.
If you're still following these ethos, you're probably going to have to leave in general, right?
This is where I think the Constitution did something was the right solution. The Constitution tried to lock in the ethos of the revolutionaries at the time. Like they had all these revolutionaries, and they all kind of agreed on this ethos of what it means to be free and have liberty and these things, right? And so they tried to formalize that ethos in the Constitution and lock it in. And by doing so, they have made it so you have a fairly small group of people in the future who are up against a much larger group of people. But because that ethos was locked in and formalized, you can kind of refer back to it, and it gives a lot more strength to your position than the people who are arguing against it. And so if we could lock in the ethos of Ethereum as censorship resistance and whatnot, those people who are fighting for censorship resistance, even if they're the minority, they might still win against the majority because they have something to point to that says, this is our ethos, this is what we're supposed to be doing. And I don't think Ethereum has locked in that ethos. The other thing is that keeping the ethos, historically, we had human-driven systems. Like back in the revolution, we had human-driven systems. There were no computers. It was just a bunch of humans interacting, right? And so the best thing you could do to lock in an ethos was put it on a piece of paper and then just tell everybody, we have to follow this piece of paper. Like that was the best you could do. Nowadays, we have blockchains that are autonomous and run themselves. And in theory, you can lock in the ethos as it's expressed by the code, the set of rules that are in the blockchain. So you can express your ethos in a formal rule set of a blockchain, and no one can change it. Like if there's no way to change the rule set, then the ethos is locked in permanently. And so this is why I want to not only ossify the social layer, I also want to ossify layer 1 because it locks in the rules as they align with ethos today. And so we have our ethos, and it's like, as a simple example, censorship resistance. Anyone can deploy a contract right now. All you need is some ETH. It's the only requirement. There's no KYC. There's no going through some approval process. There's no committee. There's also no one can take your contract off once it's deployed. Like it's there permanently. It can't be removed. And so these are the rules that have kind of enshrined, the rules as they are today, enshrine that censorship resistance right into the base layer. And same thing with staking. All you need is ETH to stake. You don't need to do any KYC. You don't need to do any, go in through regulatory hurdles or anything like that. You just start staking and you can start participating. And so by ossifying layer 1, we are guaranteeing that other people can't come in and change those rules to be something else. We're ossifying our ethos into the rule set today so that people can't change the rule set later and therefore change the ethos that the rules express. And so I do think we definitely need to ossify layer 0 first, is most important, which hasn't been done, unfortunately. I think there's a little bit of kind of hints that people kind of semi-agree on financial privacy, censorship resistance, whatnot, but it's pretty weak these days. And we don't have like any sort of document we can point at and say, see, right here it says we care about censorship resistance as a group. And if you don't hear about that, you should go join a different group. And we don't have anything to point to for that. And so I do worry that the ethos at layer 0 is kind of dwindling. And so ossification of layer 1 helps us lock that in, which further protects us from people coming in and trying to change the ethos.
Yeah, but I think what you see sometimes is like, now we're in a place like a lot of the current Ethereum, say, landscape is sort of it's captured by like almost the free market in some ways. Like, the economies of scale have led builders, whether it's builder centralization, whether it's, LSTs growing really fast or something like that. And now you see a lot of them are fighting for ossification in a very self-interested sort of way to sort of lock in, you know, they're sort of saying like your ethos, like actually they in a similar way like Bitcoin had, like whenever you had the block size debate back in Bitcoin, like it was like you saw some corporate interests saying, okay, this is, you know, we're ossified, we can't possibly change or do anything to add functionality to the base layer.
Yeah, so when you ossify the base layer, you ossify in the rules, which means you're ossifying in whatever ethos can fit within those rules that you have ossified, right? So if you ossify the rules, not the rules allow for builder centralization, then you're ossifying in builder centralization, and it's kind of the price you paid, so to speak. And this is a common argument for keeping things mutable, is that we can constantly combat the things we don't like that are changing. Personally, so two things about that. One, I'm okay with ossification being not today, but somewhere on the roadmap. What I dislike is not having an agreement where that is. Like you talk to 10 core devs, they'll all tell you, oh yeah, we're going to ossify eventually. Every single one of them will tell you a different point in time when. And the problem there is that each time one of them gets to the point that they would like to ossify and it doesn't, they drop out. And someone replaces them, and that person then has an even further future ossification timeline. And so you have this kind of ossification is constantly on the horizon, never reached. And so you're always working towards it and you never get there. And so one way to solve the problem you described is if you're confident your system is not in a healthy state right now, and many people believe that. People believe the builder centralization problem or the centricity problem, like these are not healthy things. We need to fix them before we ossify. I think that's reasonable. Just set down and come up with a list of saying we need to fix these N things, and then we will definitely ossify. The counter to that is that by the time you finish fixing those things, you will find new things that are broken. And we see this with the Ethereum roadmap, right? Ethereum roadmap started out with, oh, we're going to add proof of stake eventually, and otherwise that's it. And now the Ethereum roadmap includes, ZK proof stuff because mathematical technology has advanced, and so we have new tech that we can use. We see privacy things that were, I guess, part of the ZK proof stuff. We see the scaling problems that we didn't recognize, back in when it was created. And so the longer you don't ossify, there's always going to be some new thing that you can find a very good reason to say, let's, solve that too before we ossify. In the end, this kind of back and forth, there's arguments on both sides. They're good arguments on all the sides. I personally believe the answer here is the same thing. I used my car analogy before, if I buy a Toyota, Corolla today, and I can use it for the next, 10, 20 years, however long it lasts. If I take good care, it'll last a while. And it's okay that someone else goes and buys a different car, like a Tesla or something, right after me, or maybe a few years later. Like someone can go make a better car. I don't need to move to that car. I could move to that car. I could sell my Corolla and go buy a Tesla. That's okay. And I think a lot of people really want, they want the one train to rule them all. And I'm very much not a fan of that. I'm very much a fan of Bitcoin is great. And I think it will be great for some time. It's not my cup of tea. I'm more of an Ethereum person. The contracts are a big win for me, especially the smart contract wallets are really the number one reason I don't just use Bitcoin. It's because I want social recovery and time-based recovery for my assets. I do not trust myself to secure a private key against both theft and loss at the same time for any reasonable amount of time. And so for me, Ethereum is better than Bitcoin. But I have no problem with people using Bitcoin. I think it's totally fine if they're comfortable with that. They can use it. They can use Lightning Network if they want. They can do all these things. Ethereum, in my opinion, replaces it. And at some point in the future, something will replace Ethereum. And I'm okay with that too. When that time comes, I will probably not be an early adopter. I might, dabble my toes in a little bit, but I'll stick with Ethereum for a while because it works for me. Just like my Corolla works for me. I don't need to move to a Tesla right away. But, maybe at some point I'll switch over to the new thing. This gets back to, and just for clarity, everything in the world is complicated and there's no clear answers to anything. This then circles back to you really want one currency. You don't want a dozen currencies in the world. You want one medium of exchange. And if we go with this, okay, you build a blockchain, it ossifies, and then everybody who built that then goes and starts working on the next blockchain. They work for 5 years and they release a new blockchain, they have a new one. You really don't want to change currencies every 5 years. And you don't want, every retailer to have to integrate a new currency into their system every 5 years. You want it to be like you can integrate, the Visa network, and the Visa network just works for 50 years, and you don't have to change every 5. And so the problem with having many chains is that just integrating with the rest of the world, we want them to integrate, and it's going to be very hard if you have a newfangled chain every 5 years. And the other problem is as currencies, generally you have a winner takes all, and so we're close to it. And so if Ethereum comes out and it's strictly better than Bitcoin, eventually Bitcoin goes to zero, and now Bitcoin doesn't have that selling point of, okay, it's a long-term store of value. But once you see that Bitcoin wasn't a long-term store of value, now you think, well, Ethereum's eventually going to be replaced, so it's also not a long-term store of value, so I should not hold that. And the next thing is also not a long-term store of value because it's going to be replaced by the next thing. And so there's no good solution here. I think for that last problem, there is one thing you can do, which is when you spin up a new blockchain, it's not seeded with miners. It's just seeded by just literally airdropping everybody who had the previous thing. And so everybody, if ETH was seeded by just everybody who has a Bitcoin at a certain point in time now has ETH, you can kind of make it so that Bitcoin still has value as expressed by ETH. And when the next thing comes out that's better than ETH, it's just mints everybody who had ETH, a coin to start with. And so you can make it so you don't have this problem of these cryptocurrencies driving to zero because they're replaced by something better eventually. It's not a perfect solution. It's slightly better, not great. And it's really hard to convince people to do this because you have to give away a whole lot of money to people who had money
I would
before.
actually say that that's like on the one currency, not to go down this debate too much, but I would say that's one of the reasons that cryptocurrencies have sort of taken off is that if the one currency is, say, the US dollar, you have a group of individuals who don't necessarily like, say, the ethos of the US dollar, or especially even the distribution of the US dollar. So you're going to make your own and minting it, say, your own way. And I sort of see that as like a natural life cycle in some ways.
Yeah, there's definitely contention there. Yeah, I agree. And I think that there's a lot of value in upsetting the old system and replacing it with something new. And I think the trick is the timing. Like if each blockchain had a life expectancy of, say, 30 years, it's probably good enough. It's good enough to have value, be used for a while, and then eventually taper off at the end and have a nice, slow, comfortable demise. Whereas if you're getting blockchains replacing each other every 5 years because tech is advancing so fast, then you have just too much change for people, just for humans. Humans can't handle that frequency of rotating through the next new thing.
Maybe it's like we're just going to go back. It's like the biblical debt forgiveness. We'll just sort of the Jubilee every 7 years, and we wipe out financial debt, and we all move to a new system, and it'll be.
And perhaps, I would not be opposed to that.
Right.
It'd be certainly interesting.
Everyone moves from the dollar over to Ethereum, and then we move on in 7 years.
Yeah.
Wipe debts.
Yeah. Right, and you can show, when the Jubilee occurred, I held the most Bitcoin, so it's my scorecard. And then you go try it again and see if you can reproduce it on Ethereum, and see if you can hold the most Ethereum at the end, and you repeat. So it just turns into a game where it's just like make as much as you can in the 7-year period between blockchains, and then they become worthless, but you have the NFT that says you were the richest at the end.
Pretty sure we could make this. This will be good. Yeah, no, this was. Yeah, I mean, we're already on an hour and a half. This episode's been awesome already. I think anything else you would want to touch on, I guess, or wrap up with?
I don't know. Did you want to talk about Tornado at all? Or is that?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to. So, what would be, what does privacy look like from here on chain?
My hope is that privacy looks like the U.S. court system agrees that the government or the prosecutors are very wrong in banning financial privacy, and they absolve the Tornado developers of all charges, and the legal fights against OFAC all pan out successfully, and OFAC has to rescind their ban of Tornado Cash. At that point, then building privacy in the U.S. is actually pretty safe because now you have case law that supports it, versus just theoretical case law, right? So that's the most optimistic solution. We won't have an answer to any of that for many months, at least, and then even then, there's a good chance. I'm pretty reasonably confident in the Supreme Court in the U.S. that they will rule rationally. Like I've listened in on some of their cases, and I tend to read their opinions at the end, and they're actually pretty well reasoned group of people, like the Supreme Court. I don't agree with all their decisions, but they're very logical thinkers, and I think I'm pretty confident that if any of these cases make it to the Supreme Court will see reason and logic, and they will recognize the problems. And so even if any of these cases get lost in the first round, as long as there are people willing to pay the cost of escalating, I think eventually they will resolve what I believe to be correct. I can't be sure about that. Again, the Supreme Court doesn't always make decisions that I agree with, but I think in general they're not dumb. Like, they're not idiots. The lower courts often make decisions that I think are wrong. I mean, this is why the court system has the escalation game, right? As they're trying to resolve it early, and then you have this escalation, and as long as there's someone willing to pay money to escalate, you can escalate, and eventually you get to the top court, which in theory is pretty good. So that's the best case scenario. Worst case scenario is all these cases fail, and building privacy tech in the US becomes illegal. It probably becomes illegal in Europe as well, especially if Alexi's case somehow gets escalated up to the European courts, and then the European courts say, no, building privacy tech is in fact not legal. That's very bad. I think if that occurs, then I think we'll still see privacy tech being built. It'll just be built anonymously. It's not going to be built by people who have real identities. And I think the bigger problem, though, is that even if these cases all come back positive, it just makes building privacy tech legal. It doesn't make using privacy tech legal. And that's the real problem right now, I think, is using privacy tech is essentially illegal. Not technically, but it's functionally illegal. You can't, even the people like, what are they? Is it Shapeshift, Eric Voorhees' exchange? Yeah. So even Eric is, very open about his political position, and, he talks about it all the time on Twitter, but Shapeshift does not accept any privacy coins. And I believe it's because even this guy who is willing to spit in the face of regulators and be like, you know what, you want to regulate my industry out of business? I'm just going to build a decentralized one. And he's taken the biggest steps towards, just taking whatever the regulators throw at him and doing everything in his power to work around them and to build good things. And even he is not willing to accept privacy coins like Zcash and whatnot. And that's very telling to me. Like, when the most willing person to push the line in the whole industry publicly, like with his face attached to it, is unwilling to accept privacy coins, it tells you that there's a big problem, that no one will accept privacy coins. This is true. There are very few exchanges that accept privacy coins, particularly regulated exchanges. And there are ways to get privacy coins, out of like Zcash and whatnot. Also, there's Tornado, which is on ETH, but we're starting to see these like if you try to use any money that has gone through Tornado to do anything in the real world, you can't. Like, you can't open an exchange account. If you send an exchange account, the exchange account usually just steals them. I've had this happen multiple times. I've lost so much money by sending money to either a payment processor or an exchange, and then having them tell me, we need to do all this KYC on you. And like, you know what, just send the money back. And they're like, no, we can't. Until you do the KYC, we're keeping the money. And they claim that they're required by law to keep the money. I've tried fighting them on that. I've been like, please show me the law. And they pointed to the law, and I'm like, yeah, this law clearly says you don't have to keep the money. You're supposed to send it back. And they're like, yeah, but we'd rather keep the money. And we know that if you care about privacy, you clearly are not going to take us to court, because that would violate your privacy. So we're just going to keep the money and trust that you're not going to do anything about it. And sadly, they're often right. Not generally willing to go to court with them. One of these days I might, but so far I haven't. And so I think what we're going to start to see, sadly, is privacy become harder and harder to do. So you can use Tornado Cash, but now you've got to basically launder your legal money. So you use Tornado Cash to hide the source of your funds. Again, assuming you got legal money here, so you made money via work or employment or investment or whatever, but you don't want everybody to know how much you made. And so you run it through Tornado Cash, but now you've got to then go run it through a laundry service to make it so you can actually use that money that you legitimately acquired. And I don't have a good solution for this, like, other than just making laundry services easier to use, but that's not an easy task, and also not great. Like, ideally, we figure out some way to get one or more large economies to accept that privacy is normal and financial privacy is an allowable thing. And unfortunately, most major economies right now are very strongly against financial privacy. US, China, Russia, EU. In theory, EU, I think, is the closest to being okay with financial privacy in theory, but their bureaucracy is insurmountable, and so I don't see positive regulations coming from the EU for financial privacy anytime soon. So I don't have great answers here, unfortunately. I wish I did.
My one underground theory is that this is what meme coins are. So you go launch like a loser Micah token and then pump it to the moon, and sell it out, and then you now have clean funds, and then
it is one of the ways that to launder money, so to speak. And again, I say launder here, but in the U.S., money laundering is only if the assets were criminal to start with. It's not money laundering if you're cleaning, so to speak, already clean money. And so it's actually not illegal in the U.S. to take your money and fake it through your car wash business, as long as the money started clean. It's only illegal if the money started dirty, and then you concealed those assets. And so that's a very clear distinction that has been upheld in case law and everything. And so, I mean, maybe meme coins, but then you have the problem of eventually regulators will notice that, hey, all the car washes are just money laundering businesses, and eventually all the meme coins are meme laundering, and then meme coins are now illegal. And like, it doesn't end well.
It's super tough, and it's one of those things that hopefully like it ultimately comes back down to kind of what we've been talking about this whole time, and just like the necessity of a good social layer in your crypto system, and then also in your legal system expanding to meet space. Like you need to make sure that the U.S. government actually is, or wherever you live, protects your rights, and because ultimately it's
So. I think the thing that makes me most optimistic is that if we can convince, we meaning the population, world population as a whole, if we can convince one country of even mediocre size to officially have crypto, like a real decentralized crypto, not a CBDC or something, but a real cryptocurrency as their national currency, I think that would change things drastically, because that gives a place where you can go to spend your crypto and meet space, especially if we can convince one country to have a privacy protecting coin as their official currency. Like that's the biggest win. And again, it doesn't need to be a big country. It can be, some smaller country. We need one. And once there's one, then all of a sudden you have, this crypto is no longer magic internet money. It is now something that you can actually go travel to this country and buy things, whatever those things are. And then that country, in theory, gets businesses that show up there because they want to sell to these people that have crypto. And so maybe you have some people making yachts, and they move their yacht making business to this little country, wherever it is. Or you have people, start doing tourism in that country, or medical tourism, or all these things that, you can start selling to this whole class of people who have this internet money that they can't spend because it's, illegal to spend everywhere else in the world. But there's at least one place, and it gives it that kind of fundamental value that you always want your currency ideally to have, where when all else fails, you can go spend it there. And then that, I think, will then, my hypothesis is that if one country does that, they'll see a sudden boom in their economy, and then other countries will want to follow because they also want that boom in their economy. And so if we can somehow show the world that the way you make your economy boom is by making crypto your national currency, particularly a privacy coin, then I think you'd see a lot of good things and a kind of a chain reaction. That first one is the hard one, though.
No, it's super cool. Anyway, this was a blast. Where can people find you on Twitter or on the web?
So I'm technically on Twitter, but I'm in a half boycott of it since they stopped making it so you can browse tweet threads in a private browsing window. It really pissed me off. And so I don't post anything directly, but I reply to people. So that's my half boycott, is I refuse to post anything new, but I'll reply. So if you happen to follow me and other interesting people at the same time, you'll see my replies show up in your feed. If you only follow me, then you'll probably see nothing because I never post anything directly. I only post replies. As far as elsewhere, I have let's see if I can find it. I have a blog, Micah-Zoltu.medium.com is my older blog. I've got a newer one. I don't post a lot in either of these places, so don't expect high volume.
Yeah, well, this is, we'll link it in the notes, and we can also link the new Augur V3, whatever we want to call it, design as well. So
there you go. Okay, so I posted in chat there, listed.2
Awesome. Yeah, well, we'll post it. And again, this was awesome. Thank you for coming on, Micah.
Yep, thank you for having me.